to be a useful idiot. And if they're thinking of doing something that's going to stir the pot, they kind of nudge the Russians to try it first to see how it goes. And the Taiwan War would fall into that category. So they saw the Ukraine war as a useful proxy. And it hasn't gone the way that they thought. So, number one, they thought the war would be physically easy because, you can walk to Kiev, and the Ukrainians have only been preparing for 8 years. Well, you got to swim to Taipei, and the Taiwanese have been preparing for 45. And so when the war in Ukraine got bogged down, like, crap, assumption one gone. Assumption number two, they thought the Russian weapons were great, so they cloned them. They stole the IP just like they have for everybody else, and cloned $3 trillion worth of them. And they're now having some very, very serious buyer's remorse, although I guess it would be theft remorse. So, assumption two gone. Assumption three is that everyone will just get over it. Well, we now have the most robust sanctions regime in history on the Russians. And it would be a lot worse for China because Russia is a massive exporter of food and energy. China is the world's biggest importer of both. But I think what has really terrified the Politburo are the boycotts. Because here you have private citizens and companies who, without prodding from their governments, have just walked away from, $500 billion of sunk costs. There is no Chinese economic system without international trade, foreign technology, and market access. And the idea that Halliburton has left Russia on moral grounds, there is no moral cover for anyone who wanted to stay in Russia. And the Chinese look at their system like, they were doing a genocide long before the Russians started. This is a country that isn't a democracy. This is a country that cracks down on protesters. This is a country with a horrible record of social management. There's a lot more places for Western ideology to kind of get their claws into if you really want to take it down. And they now know that the West is perfectly capable of doing it.
The financial sanctions against Russia prompted a lot of conversation about the weaponization of the dollar.
Sure.
Would it prompt the Chinese to look to increase trade in yuan, especially when you're talking about oil, petro yuan, for example? Do you think that there's any possibility of that? Would Middle East producers entertain the idea of pricing oil in yuan? Could they find traction with that?
I don't think there'd be a lot. One of the things we saw with the Russians, and when they tried to move away from the dollar and the euro, they went into whatever currency was available. And honestly, there weren't a lot left at that point. But they did put about $250 billion, if memory serves, into the yuan. And then when they tried to cash it in later, the Chinese were like, nope, we don't want that back. And so the Russians have been forced to move back into the euro and the dollar, just do it really quietly, because there just aren't a lot of options. And then, of course, they fly around a lot of gold. That's really their most reliable way of getting around sanctions. So there's not a lot of options. In the case of the Persian Gulf, there might be some room there, because the Saudis in particular, now that the United States is no longer their largest consumer and no longer their security guarantor, they've been looking for a new friend. The Chinese have come in with a lot of money and a lot of demand. And so the Saudis have done kind of a co-investment thing in industrial plant in China and refineries, just like they did in the United States. And having a yuan trade for that specific sales line, that makes a degree of sense. But keep in mind that if there is a conflict that involves China and the United States, no ships will be coming and going from China. So the Saudis know full well that if you are involved in a hot war with the United States, your tankers don't go there. And so there would be no point in a hot war scenario for the Saudis to do that. Yeah, in a hot war scenario, we are talking about the deindustrialization of the Chinese system and famine within a year, because this is a country that imports 75% of its energy and 75% of the inputs that allow it to grow its own food. If, I don't think there will be, if we do have a conflict over Taiwan that does involve either Japan, the United States, Vietnam, or India, because any one of them can do this, that is the end of China as a modern industrialized power with over 1 billion people.
We're discussing, in that region and the China needing that global trade. India has really set itself up as the alternative, as everyone's looking to make sure they reduce their dependence. We're going to be touching on India as part of a series and talking about the digital transformation, because they have managed in a way at scale to start pulling people into their formal economy through their digital ID system that they've put in place. Is India in any way set up or able to help in this situation where help, but contribute or fill a gap of this declining China, supply chains that are now reshoring but are going to be broken for a while. How does India fit into this picture?
The answer is yes and no. So I am broadly bullish on India. It's set apart from most of the world's problems. It's the first stop on the shipment route from Persian Gulf to the oil markets of Asia. It's never going to have an energy crisis. And its security issues with Pakistan and Bangladesh, not that they're minor, but they're kind of ossified. And they only are going to boil up into a hot war if something goes really, really wrong in multiple places. So I don't think it's very likely. So the problems of India aren't going to go away. So the digitalization, for example, that you brought up, that can happen, but never for the whole population. But that's okay. Uh, if only a third of the economy, if only a third of the population get brought into the modern age, that's still more people than the European Union. And you can have a growth story. And just like the United States and NAFTA, we're going to have to build a lot of industrial plants to replace what we're going to lose from Germany and China. So will India. So that's a growth story too. But India will never have partners. The countries on its borders are either too poor or too hostile. They will never be integration targets. And everyone else is too far away. And the Indians have never been in favor of free trade. So any manufacturing and industrial build out in India is going to be for the Indians, just like most of the build out in North America is going to be for the most of the North Americans. That will limit the quality level, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be successful. So India is India doing things for India based on its own logic. And that is a very good story. But if you think that they're about to become a major global power, no, they never have been because they've been too isolated. So you can have a very strong success story and still be it not part of a global story.
Interesting. So there have been a lot of people sort of, India also a democracy, and people see that as an advantage. But there's been a lot of concern globally about the rise of authoritarianism, right?
Sure.
This is a sort of in elections all over the place. If you look, any of those sort of shift to the right, or I don't even know if it's proper to say that, but if you look at where you've seen this sort of move to the right or move to more strongmen type of regimes, they look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and think what?
This really isn't going the direction we thought it was going to go. And you're right. It's not a left versus right thing. It's a dictator versus non-dictator. It doesn't matter where in the political spectrum you can. We've had plenty of examples, or it doesn't matter where in the political spectrum you've come from. We've got plenty of examples from across the spectrum of how you just have individuals who have decided that they are the big man. On the whole, I've been very encouraged by the events of the last year because we've seen in most places authoritarianism has been failing. They can't generate the economic activity past a certain point that is necessary to maintain public support. I think we're going to see some cracks in the Chinese facade in the not too distant future. The Russian system is clearly in failure, and the Chinese system is not far behind. It's not that I think the Chinese system was sustainable, but political breakdowns within Beijing have now reached the point that it's glaringly obvious to anyone who's willing to really have an open mind on it that we really are seeing a system that is in its final stages of dysfunction. There are exceptions. I am concerned about what's going on in Mexico. AMLO has decided that he wants to be not so much Nicaragua, but Cuba. No, that's not even fair. I mean, Turkey is probably the closest comparison to what's going on in Mexico.